Great. Um, here in our last session together, we're going to do a little bit of reading of Psalms again, as we have been over the last couple of weeks. And then I'll do a little wrap up, and then that'll be it. Some questions, I'm sure, and some time with some important time with Kelly at the end. I have asked you for this week just to look at a couple of Psalms. Having gone through last week where I sort of had to rush through the third, I figured let's just take the time with the two. And what I chose, I'll admit, are two kind of weird, wacky Psalms. Psalms 82 and 114. Totally different in their ways, but two Psalms that I, again, choose the Psalms that I like. So two Psalms that I like a lot, but two Psalms that are probably not very much like the rest of the Psalms in the book. Even though I'm hoping as we talk about them, you'll see that they are, like almost every Psalm, they are incorporating elements that are recognizable from elsewhere and sort of reconfiguring them in interesting ways. So let's jump into Psalm 82, which is truly a Psalm unlike any other. Um, Psalm 82 begins with essentially a scene setting. And if you have the Psalm in front of you, and if you looked over it before joining tonight, uh, it's useful, I think, to think about Psalm 82 really as like it's a scene. It's almost a script. And this is with like characters talking at various times, and it's useful to keep in mind who's talking and to whom and about what and where everybody is. So the psalm or the sort of script starts with the setting. God stands in the divine assembly. Um, Among the divine beings, he pronounces justice. It really just says there he judges. So let's back up here. The divine assembly is uh, again, I'm using the JPS translation just for ease, but it doesn't really say divine assembly. It says literally the assembly of Ale. So you can see there, but a dot is assembly, and Ale is is a generic term for God sometimes, uh, but is also, and I think I've talked about this before, is also the name of the sort of like head of the Canaanite pantheon. This is like the chief deity, right? El is the father of Baal, whom you are probably more familiar with, right? Baal, the Canaanite storm god, and the one that Elijah is fighting with in the Book of Kings. So here is God, Elohim, presumably our God, that is Yahweh, standing in a council that is, or an assembly or a council that is like headed by El, the chief Canaanite deity. So we are not in our own world here. We are definitely up in the heavenly realm somewhere. We're in a divine assembly. You can picture El like seated at the head of of a circle with the other deities arranged around. And they're all, I think we should imagine them all, they're all sitting there. They're all seated. And then El stands up, right? Elohim Nitzav. God stands. Elohim stands up to speak and to judge. So again, like, what's the setting here? Not only is it heavenly, but it is fundamentally polytheistic. That is to say, God, our God, seems to be one God among many, right? Among the gods, he pronounces judgment. I will admit that I am very tempted to think that the first word of this psalm should not be Elohim, God, but Yahweh. That is like the specific God of Israel, for reasons that I think become clear over the course of the psalm. But Yahweh is like the personal name of Israel's deity, and this seems to be the kind of place where you'd need like the individualistic Yahweh specific deity to contrast with the other Elohim plural deities in the second line here. So it's a little weird to have Elohim stands up amidst the Elohim. Would make a lot more sense for it to be Yahweh stands up in the midst of the other gods. But here we are. In any case, we need to understand that this is Israel's God that is arising in the setting of all of the other gods, um, essentially in a courtroom, right? He is going to judge. That's what's happening here. And the next line in verse 2 is God's accusation. How long will you judge perversely, showing favor to the wicked? Now, if you are familiar with other biblical texts, and I'm thinking here of certainly other Psalms, but especially lots of prophetic texts, this is the classic prophetic complaint, right? You powerful kings and rulers in Judah and Samaria, you judge perversely, you show favor to the wicked, right? You don't take up the cause of the needy, right? This is the kind of language that we've seen that we see sort of regularly, even and not just in prophetic texts, even in legal texts, right? And here it is addressed not as it is elsewhere to humans or to human judges who are being sort of unfair in their judgments, but in fact to the gods. A reminder that in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world more generally, judgment and justice were understood to be divine characteristics. We've seen this already, back when we were talking about sort of the big themes of the Psalms. We talked about these enthronement Psalms where that really often have sort of God taking his seat in judgment and in ruling. Justice is supposed to be a divine characteristic that human judges and human kings emulate. So here, what's happening here is this is really becoming an issue of theodicy, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do you show favor to the wicked? Why do you judge perversely? That question of theodicy, right? Why do bad things happen to good people, or vice versa, is here understood to be a failure on the part of the deities, right? Whose job it is to ensure that justice prevails in the world. And evidently, they're not doing their jobs particularly well. So, this is taking this human language, right, of actual judging, right, and elevating it to the divine sphere. Things on earth seem to be happening perversely. These gods are failing in their main task, which is the upholding of justice. And of course, we should note, like, the irony is that God. Yahweh is here judging the other gods, right? So God stood up to judge in the divine council, right? He is judging the other gods on the basis of how badly they judge. And so again, we had the opening scene where we knew where we were. Now God is here in verse 2 addressing the other gods directly, right? He stands up in this divine council and he looks around and goes, "How long will you, plural, how long will you, plural, judge perversely?" And now he tells them, having said what they're doing badly, he says what they should be doing in verses 3 and 4. Judge the wretched and the orphan, vindicate the lowly and the poor, rescue the wretched and the needy, save them from the hand of the wicked. This is the third verse in a row that uses the word judge, the verb to judge. Each time differently. First, in the first verse, God stands up to judge. Then in the second verse, the gods are accused of judging perversely. And here they are instructed to judge correctly. Again, like leaving no question in our mind, I think, about what the main theme of the psalm is. It's clearly justice. And there's a structure here that is not so dissimilar from one we saw, for example, last week with Psalm 29, where sort of like a set of three and then a fourth that varies a little bit. So you got here in verses 3 and 4, you've got three verbs: judge, vindicate, rescue, each time followed by a pair of objects that describes the vulnerable classes that are supposed to be cared for, right? Judge, the wretched and the orphan; vindicate, the lowly and the poor; rescue, the wretched and the needy. And then a little switch at the end, a fourth verb, also like the same verb, right? Judge, vindicate, rescue, save, but now not with the people who need saving, but with a reference to the people who are actually oppressing, right? The hand of the wicked. Remember, in the previous verse, we also saw the wicked, right? The gods were showing favor to the wicked. Like how long will you show favor to the wicked? It said in the previous verse. And here we've got you should be saving the poor and the vulnerable and the wretched, the orphan and the lowly and the needy from the hand of those same wicked, using the same word, rishaim. Um, uh, you'll also perhaps notice here that you've got like this you've got this bodily image for the oppressors, right? In the verse before, in verse 2, the gods are literally lifting their faces. And here that's the showing favor idiom. And here we're saving them from their hands, from the hands of the wicked. Um, there's we should I always like to be attentive to the ways that biblical poetry in particular uses bodies and body language in really expressive ways, in a way that is, sort of grounds it more than I think the kind of lofty theological that we often uh, assume. Okay, so God said, you guys are doing everything wrong. Here's what you should be doing. And now in verse 5, uh, he's clearly not talking to the accused anymore, because he's talking about them in the third person. They neither know nor understand. They go about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth totter. So having leveled the accusation directly to against the other gods, here it's like God, Yahweh, is turning to some jury and sort of like pointing at them and being like, look at these clowns. Um, who is this jury? Well, I mean, it may well be El, right? In whose counsel all this is happening, right? You've got the supreme deity, El, and you've got Yahweh and all of these other gods who are supposed to be actually carrying out on the earth justice. And it's like God turns to El, the great divine judge, and is like, these gods fail at the basic skills of discernment necessary for correct judgment, right? They neither know nor understand. And then, again, actually using language that, if you are really familiar with a book like, say, Isaiah, this is Isaiah uses this language too, right? About Israel. Israel neither knows nor understands, right? Like they failed to see the divine plan. They're constantly screwing up. They neither see nor understand. They neither know nor understand. Isaiah will also say, right, they're blind, they're deaf, and that's similar stuff that's happening here, right? They go about in darkness, which is an idiom that is often associated directly with blindness, and also directly associated with laws against bribing judges, right? If you can hear in the back of your mind somewhere, right, in Exodus, it says, right, like you shall not, right, like you shall not take a bribe, because bribes, it says in Exodus, blind the clear-sighted, right? Bribery prohibits judges from seeing who's right and who's wrong, and that leads to precisely the perverse justice that we saw above in the accusation in verse 2. I will admit, this whole thing to me also, right? They neither know nor understand, and they walk about in darkness. Also, it rings to me like Genesis 3, right? With the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of which the serpent says will open Eve's eyes, right? The power of discernment. In that story, you also have God walking about using this exact same verb for walking about. Just before we get to the judgment of Adam and Eve, I think there's lots of themes that are playing together. Again, I'm not actually suggesting that this psalm knows Genesis 3 or vice versa, but that both are partaking of a sort of a common set of language and concepts. In the last line here, right, all the foundations of the earth totter. Now, we have seen this. We've seen this language a couple of times in different ways. This is playing with this common tradition that links sort of the security of the world's foundations. I mean, I think literally, but also figuratively, with righteous, justice-filled divine rule, right? If the gods are carrying out justice correctly, the earth stands firm. In other, as I suggested before, in other psalms, in sort of enthronement psalms, especially, you see things like, Yahweh takes his seat on his throne, often, enthroned above the flood, which we've seen before, and we get something like, and the world stands firm; it cannot be shaken, or it cannot be, you know, it cannot be. I have handle in my head. It cannot be moved. Um, so there's this link between justice and the earth not shaking, or between justice and the earth's firmness. And this is something that we see across the ancient Near East, right? When a king rules justly, the society is stable, and it's just expanded up into the divine realm. When the gods you know ensure that the world runs justly, then it stands firm. That's what royal divinity or divine kingship looks like. So here we've got like these gods who are supposed to be administering justice are failing, and the earth is therefore tottering. Uh, but it's also playing wonderfully, I think, with the line before, right? The imagery of like they go about in darkness, right? Like the idea like these deities are actually physically stumbling around, like causing the earth to shake. Um, so there's all this wonderful imagery going on. Okay, that's the accusation toward the judge, and now comes the judgment, which I think God also delivers. Um, this is I think Yahweh acting is like what is that terrible TV show? Like Jag, right? Like whatever the thing is where you get to like make the case and also deliver the verdict. That's like that's like what God's doing here. God says, this is what they're doing. This is what you're doing. This is what they're doing. Okay, here comes the judgment here in verses 6 and 7. I had taken you for divine beings, sons of the Most High, all of you. But you shall die as men do, fall like any prince. Um, and I will tell you, you can tell this from reading the transliteration here, but the opening line here is almost every word starts the same way. Ani, Amarti, Elohim, Atem, Ubnei, Elyon, all of you, Kulchem. So there's like there's this I don't know the repetition of that ah sound at the beginning sort of like is like a hammer of the accusation. Uh, so what's the upshot? The accusation is basically like God is saying, like you are your job, right? You are God's, and your job is to uphold justice. And if you fail to do your job, you will simply cease to be what you once were, right? You used to be gods, right? You were all the sons of Elyon, right? Elyon is a name we've seen before, right? That's the word for Most High, which is another title in Canaanite religion for El, that chief deity in whose council we're sitting, and which comes into the Bible as El Elyon, God Most High. So you used to all these gods were understood to be the offspring of Elyon, this chief deity. But if you fail to uphold justice, you've essentially given up that position. Now you're going to die. You're going to fall like a human, right? Like any old prince, right? Um, and there that word at the end, right? The prince, right? Like here's that royal sense again that we saw before with like the kings upholding justice. Even maybe here, like you're gonna die like a prince, almost brings in this notion of like a coup is happening here, right? These princes are falling because they have been overthrown, right? They were incapable of ruling, and Yahweh is like, all right, if you can't do it, I'm gonna have to take over for you. What it turns out we have here is like a poetic myth about the downfall of all the other gods, um, which results at the end with Yahweh, Israel's God, being like the preeminent, right? The one who is in fact ruling the earth in justice. It's not monotheistic in that sense, because the other gods clearly are out there. They've just been sort of, I don't know, dethroned from their position. And the final line right? So if this was the judgment, the final line of the poem isn't spoken by God. It's not spoken by the narrator, like in verse 1. It's not spoken by El or Elyon, who's sitting there. It's not spoken by the other deities. It seems like this last line, I think, is spoken by us, like by the audience, like the people who are watching the scene, sort of as a chorus. Um, and what does it say? Arise, O God, judge the earth. And see how that word arise recalls for us the very beginning of the poem, where God stands up in the divine assembly. And now we call on Yahweh, to arise and to judge, just as, right, he's already been judging, right? That's what it said in verse 1. He took his stand to judge in the divine council. So now we're calling on God to judge, but not to judge the divine assembly, to judge the earth, right? He's done with the judging there. That's done. Now it's his job, right? Like he said, you guys all were terrible at this, so I guess I'm gonna have to do it. So now we're saying, okay, do it. Judge the earth, take over their responsibilities, which was logically what was going to happen. I'm reminded this, I must admit, this reminds me of like a faculty meeting where I've learned over long and extensive experience that if you say that something's not going the way it ought to be, you are put in charge of fixing it, which is why in faculty meetings, one should never speak. But okay, so Yahweh hadn't learned that yet. He gets up, he complains. He's now given the job. Okay, you think you're the competent one? Fine. So arise, O God, judge the earth. Right, remember that earth, the same earth that we were told was tottering for lack of judgment earlier. For all the nations are your possession. And this is a wonderful conclusion because it feels, in a sense, like it comes out of nowhere. But if we are familiar, again, with sort of broader ancient Near Eastern, especially Canaanite mythology, suddenly it makes sense. I think I talked about this in a previous session, but there's a myth that runs sort of as a like a very an almost invisible thread through much of the Hebrew Bible. A myth that is originally Canaanite, in which Elyon, the chief deity, whom we've met already, apportioned the people and gods to each territory. So so that the I don't know, whatever, the Moabites, he was like, all right, Moabites, I'm putting you in this place, Moab, and your God will be Chemosh. And like those things go together. Now the Moabites have their land and their deity, and they're all tied up in one thing. And that's this Canaanite myth of how did everybody end up in their own place with their own deities? This is how Elyon apportioned them. And part of that story is, and Israel is the possession of Yahweh, right? Like Israel is Yahweh's people and land. And that seems to be the myth that's alluded to here. In the same, and here it's being expanded, right? Once the gods have failed at justice, now Yahweh is not just in charge of Israel, but all the nations, right? Yahweh has to judge the whole earth. And so Yahweh now gets all of the peoples as his possession. But so in other words, it's like it's like part two to that creation myth. We have apportioned all the people, all the nations among the various gods. And it turned out, well, it didn't work so well. So now it turns out Yahweh's going to take over and set things right. Anyway, as I said, it's a kind of a wild psalm because there's really not another one like it. It's not a psalm that is obviously spoken by an individual, right? So it's not like an individual lament or a psalm of thanksgiving. It's not a communal hymn. It's really like it's a little scene. It's a little script. It's a little bit of mythology poeticized for us. And it is so deeply Canaanite in a way that I hope I think is clear on the surface with El and Elyon and the council of the deities and the mythology and like but it's Canaanite to the extent that this is one psalm. There are others, including Psalm 29 that we read last week, that some scholars have been like, this psalm is so Canaanite that I think it was originally, in fact, a piece of Canaanite poetry. Like, and instead of Elohim as the like main character, it was probably Baal. Right? This may well have been a Canaanite poem about Baal taking over um, taking over in the divine council, uh, and then Israel sort of took it over and replaced Baal with the more generic Elohim. Um, it's possible. I don't think it matters much, and there's no way of ever knowing. But the point, the reason that comes up is because this is really like this doesn't feel like the kind of thing you'd expect to find in the Bible, right? It is so manifestly acknowledges polytheism as a thing, even as it's sort of suggesting that our God is better than all the other gods. A council of deities that are supposed in a perfect world would be doing their jobs correctly. Very not standard sort of classic biblical stuff. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's such a fantastic, interesting, weird, and also, again, beautifully poetic, repetitive, words that come back and themes that recur, and it pulls on the judging, and the opening line and the last line really tie the whole thing. It's beautifully done. Okay, that was weird poem number one. Weird psalm number two. Um, Shorter, not substantially shorter. It feels shorter because Psalm 114, if you have looked at it already, the middle of it is essentially one repetitive block. In any case, here we go. Now, if the psalm before that we just looked at, Psalm 82, pulls on Canaanite mythology and sort of ideas about enthronement and justice and kingship, and like divine kingship, this poem, this psalm feels like it pulls on traditions that we know from Israel's like early history narratives, as we'll see as we go. And I want to think with you about the ways that this poem is and isn't reflecting the stories that we know. Okay, so when Israel went forth from Egypt, I know what story that is. The house of Jacob from a people of strange speech, which is a very long English way of expressing a very short Hebrew sentence. But okay, so when Israel left Egypt, Judah became his holy one. I assume God's holy one. Israel, his dominion. So again, right, like this feels not like what kind of psalm is this? It's not a lament. It's not Thanksgiving. It's not a hymn. It's like a little storytelling. It's very narrative. In fact, it's narrative to the extent that it's using the kinds of grammatical constructions that we almost never find in poetry, right? It begins with this like temporal construction. When Israel went forth from Egypt, I can think of almost no other examples of that kind of thing happening in poetry. So it starts off with a very prose, even though it's obviously poetry, but a very narrative sense of the thing. It's also doing some lovely wordplay here. Again, if you are reading it and thinking about it in Hebrew, it starts B'tzeit Yisrael, Mitzrayim, B'tzeit Yisrael, when Israel went out, Beit Yaakov. So you've got B'tzeit and Beit, and the very classic pairing of Israel and Jacob. B'tzeit Yisrael, Beit Yaakov, and then Mitzrayim, and then Me'am Lo'ez from Egypt, from a people that talk funny, which is a funny way of thinking about Egypt. Okay, so again, think about what story is being told here. When Israel went forth, Judah became his holy one, Israel his dominion. I like there the fact that it uses Judah and Israel in a pair, right? Making clear that we're not talking about just the southern kingdom or the northern kingdom, but the whole of the thing. Became his holy one, or maybe his holy place, his dominion. So that's kind of like the Exodus story, certainly where Israel goes out of Egypt, and that's when God gives them laws and covenant and tabernacle, and right, the things that fall into the category of like holiness. But it's a very abstracted version of that story, to be sure. And one might ask, like, is this telling of Israel's history beginning with Exodus? That is, what does it think of or know about the the stories of Genesis, really, the patriarchal stories. A thing that I have said in um, uh, courses past, but I suppose I haven't had an opportunity to say here, is scholars tend to think that there are two foundation myths of Israel that both exist in the Bible. One is the one in Genesis, right? We've lived there forever. Our ancestors dwelt there and built altars and buried their dead there, and that's why we're here. And another one that originally said we emerged from Egypt, and that's when God sort of picked us up and adopted us and found us in the wilderness and saved us, and that's when it all started. The story we have canonically blends the two together, but especially as you get out into poetry, into the prophets, uh, into the Psalms, into other texts like that, you see places where you get references like this that look like Israel's story begins with the departure from Egypt with no knowledge whatsoever of the patriarchs. And what makes this one interesting is it looks like it starts with Exodus, but then it says the house of Jacob, which feels like a call, at least with name, back to the patriarchs. Okay, next verses. Again, really wonderful to think about what the narrative is here. The sea saw them and fled. The Jordan ran backward. Mountains skipped like rams, hills like sheep. Okay, back to the first part. The sea saw them and fled. If I'm like, it feels familiar, right? Like that's the splitting of the sea in the middle in Exodus. The Jordan ran backward. I kind of know that story too, right? That's from when they crossed the Jordan in the book of Joshua. Um, Two stories that we have in Exodus and Joshua of waters being like stopped for Israel to pass through. But having said that, this doesn't feel quite like this, like the sea saw them and fled. Is that the same story we have in Exodus 14, right? Not quite. This makes it sound like Israel was leaving and the water sort of just naturally did this. As if this isn't Moses standing there holding his staff. There's no sense here of the Egyptians chasing them. And if we were to see this couplet sort of in the abstract, the sea saw them and fled, the Jordan ran backward, we would think in terms of parallelism, right, that it's actually telling us just one thing, right? It's really about like a body of water or bodies of water did something unusual in the face of Israel's moving through the wilderness, which is where we are, right? It is, God has taken them out of Egypt, or they have left Egypt, and now they're on their way to becoming God's, possession. That there's moving toward Canaan, and nature is sort of like this whole verse. These two verses is really about nature reacting to Israel's just presence. Mountains skip like rams, hills like sheep. You should recognize that. That's almost identical language from what we had in Psalm 29. But so here's a psalm that's picking up, even as it's telling the story of Israel, it's picking up our storm language, right? The mountains skipped like rams. Remember in Psalm 29, that was right, like he made Lebanon to skip like a ram. It's almost exactly the same like the same language. Um, and the hills like sheep. So, it's like it feels like it's referring to stories we know, but it's also just talking about the convulsions of nature, which is both storm imagery, as we've seen, of God moving through, and here is imagery of Israel moving through the wilderness, causing the same thing. Again, tying Israel's movement to God's movements. And it's like it's so much packed in. It's narrative, it's storm imagery, it's mythology, it's just so many things going on. It's hard to exactly know where to find a footing here. And then in the next verses, we get virtually the exact same words, almost identical, except for the opening word, "What alarmed you?" Right? In Hebrew, even closer. All right, like, and those opening words, "What alarmed you?" That's JPS translation. The Hebrew says, Malacha, like, what's with you? What's with you, O sea, that you ran away? O Jordan, that you ran backwards? O mountains, that you skipped like rams? O hills, like sheep? And what do we think about this? What's up with you? Is it like, is this taunting them? Like, what are you like? What are you scared of us? Is it wonder at what feels like this miracle? Um, Again, and I will add that our translation here puts it in the past tense, right? Like, because you know, when Israel went, then this happened, and so it's logical to say, oh, what happened to you that you should have done that? But in the Hebrew, it's not actually in the past. It's in it's called the imperfect, right? A not completed. You know, if I were reading just in the Hebrew, it would be like, "What's up with you, OC, that you are fleeing? Oh, Jordan, that you are running backward." So it's almost as if this, you know, the speaker here, and who knows who this speaker is, it doesn't feel like the narrator of the first few verses is like experiencing the thing and like looking around like, what is even happening? Um, uh, and so we get the opening sort of narrative scene of the Exodus. We get this nature convulsing with sort of allusions to narrative elements that we know, and then we get the repetition of it, and then we finish the psalm here. Tremble, O earth. Now again, I'm wondering who it is that's speaking. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord. So I now this sort of feels like the answer, like why are you guys, why nature are you convulsing? Well, you ought to be, right? Because of the presence of the Lord. And you might wonder why it is, by the way, that I didn't capitalize the word Lord here as most translations do. And it's because this is not the divine name Yahweh. This is just the title, Adon, right? Just means Lord. Uh, so at the presence of, you know, the lowercase title Lord, um, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the God of Jacob. Here, another slightly odd word for the deity. Right? Adon is not a super common, right? It's Adon is an Adonai, right? Like that's the standard, at least later Hebrew way of saying God's name. But it's the title here, and then the presence of the God of Jacob, not what we would normally get there, which is Elohei Yaakov, from Elohim, but Eloah Yaakov, sort of the singular form of Elohim and a much rarer form. Um, so you should be trembling, O earth, because the God who is leading us through the wilderness is the same God who turned the rock into a pool of water, that flinty rock into a fountain. Um, Again, there at the end, that's for sure, right? Again, here's another reference to a part of the story from the Pentateuch, from the Torah that we know, right? Here's the story of God, you know, like getting water from the rock, totally fine. But again, right, look, here's two lines: who turned the rock into a pool of water, the flinty rock into a fountain, right? That's parallelism, right? That's one event being told in two ways, which makes me look back at the one about the sea and the Jordan and think that might also be one event being told in two ways as opposed to two events. In any case, it's all a little bit vague. Uh, but again, like, is this right? God who turned the rock into a pool of water. That's again like that's a very poetic and even at times prophetic, and we get it in other psalms as well, way of referring to like the Moses hitting the rock with a stick story. It's like these are stories that we know, but given to us not in the forms that we know them. Um, and so I don't actually know the answer as to whether this psalm knows our story. Does it know the Pentateuch? Does the do the Pentateuch sources know this psalm, or are they all kind of playing with an overarching sort of in the background of the whole thing myth, and this is a poetic representation? Unclear to me. A few other things about this poem before I get to my sort of final thoughts. Um, uh, for all of this, for this entire psalm, Yahweh is never named. Right? If you go back to the beginning, you have the God of Jacob, or here you have the God of Jacob, you have Adon, and you have Eloah, but it never says Yahweh, which I think is interesting. I don't have more to that. It does employ storm imagery, right? If you in the verses before we had right the convulsions of the earth. here we've got like the earth trembling, chuli. That is, again, if you remember Psalm 29, there was the verb of like that we had that same like trembling, convulsing word there. So the related to the word for like he causes, remember the line, he causes hinds to calve, same verb, right? Like it's like a twisting, trembling, convulsing word. Um, uh, I'll just show you here since I've got the screen up, right? Like verse 7, the two parts begin with the same word, milifne, milifne Adon, milifne Eloah, but the presence of the Lord, the presence of Lord, the presence of God. And the next line, verse 8, ends with the same words, agam mayim, maino mayim, right? Like a pool of water, a fountain of water. Again, just these little poetic things that make the poem like work artistically. Anyway, it's such a like it is it's an incredibly evocative poem. Again, playing with narratives and underlying myths and storm imagery. Again, I'm trying to get at here and in many of the poems that I've been bringing to our attention. I talked a few weeks ago about genre and how genre lets us identify sort of like the origins of these like forms of psalms. But that artistry really comes with like the playing with genres, the like manipulation of them. And in most of the Psalms that we've been looking at, I think that's maybe not Psalm 29, which is like a pure hymn of storm imagery, but all the rest of them, like it's language that we know from various genres that are being repurposed and reworked to express different kinds of things. In a way that I think is just I don't know. I think it's marvelous, and this is the kind of thing I'm super into. Okay, if it's not clear. All right. Final thoughts for our 6 weeks of Psalms as a whole, relatively briefly. Just a reminder of what we've talked about, right? We've talked about the book of Psalms as a book, its structure, and sort of where how it might have been put together. We talked about who wrote it. The answer was not David. We talked about the genres, the various genres that are found in the Psalms and what they're useful for in terms of thinking about, maybe the sort of liturgical origins of the genres, if not these actual poems. We talked about the poetics, right? How biblical poetry works, especially in the Psalms. So how to read for that kind of artistry. And then, we've read a series of individual Psalms that I just happen to really like. And I suppose that what I'm advocating for here in this course, if in fact I'm advocating for anything, and I like to try to advocate for something at least, but I think what I'm advocating for is reading the Psalms a little bit differently than how I think we typically do. Sometimes we read them as the actual words of David. I'm saying let's not do that because frankly, I mean, tradition of David's authorship notwithstanding, my sense of David as a character and as a potential historical human being is that he couldn't have expressed almost any of these things, which wouldn't have been in his nature, such as we know it. I'm suggesting that, we not read the Psalms as like a script for our modern prayers, even if many of them are, of course, now in our liturgy. It's not to say that we shouldn't do it that way, just not exclusively should we read that way. Even though I've tried to, I guess, make the case that the Psalms had their origins in the liturgy of ancient Israel, right, in the worship in the sanctuary. I was also trying, I hope successfully, to make the case that when we talk about where the Psalms came from, we're talking about, as I said, where the genres of the Psalms had their home in Israelite culture, never talking about like, oh, where do I think this exact Psalm that's currently in front of me came from? Which is to say, I'm advocating for us to read the Psalms as we have them, not imagined as the words of David, not imagined as ancient Israelite liturgy, not as we use them in contemporary liturgy, but like as we have them in front of us, which is to say, as written texts, as literature, as poetry. So what does it mean to read that way? It means obviously paying attention to literary features like structure and wordplay, and certainly attention to how the parallelism is working. It also means, and this is a thing that I sort of come to a lot, it means paying attention not only to how the meaning is communicated, but how the artistry is expressed, right? I want us to read the Psalms, like every single one of them, because they're all, even as they have lots of overlaps, they're all different. They're all, they all deserve their own attention. I want us to read them as both participating in a poetic tradition and actually, in a sense, as like consciously reflecting and even commenting on that tradition, right? Uh, I kind of want us to read the Psalms like we read Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare was like Shakespeare knew that Shakespeare was writing plays and poems, right? And so Shakespeare wasn't just telling the stories of his plays, right? He was exploring what he could do with the language. Um, and this like how he could play, how he could stretch meter, how he could play with structure and character, and I think our psalms are doing the same thing. And there's why not, right? Let's not dumb down our authors of the psalms just because they're a couple of thousand years older, right? These psalms, I think, clearly, and this is a thing I've been trying to do over the last couple of weeks, the psalms are clearly playing with form and content and genre and exploring the possibilities of mixing those up and coming up with new interesting things. If we concentrate solely on like the sentiment of the psalms, which I have to admit, like the sentiment of the Psalms is often relatively formulaic or generic, right? Like, what's the sentiment of a Psalm of Lament? Please help me, God, I'm in trouble. Or a Psalm of Thanksgiving. Thank you, God, I was in trouble. Or a hymn. Oh God, you're so great. Like, if we just concentrate on sentiment, I think we miss what makes these pieces of poetry actually special. And if we were just interested in sentiment, we wouldn't need so many of them. We wouldn't need 150 or 151 in the Greek or 155 in the Syriac or 156 in the Dead Sea Scroll, whatever. Just a call back to our first lesson. Um, one of the reasons that we have so many and they're all worth reading is because they're all doing something interesting artistically, even if the sentiment is so often the same. So this is my hope, that some of what we've done in our time together will make the Psalms both more accessible. Now we sort of understand what they're doing more, but also more complicated and interesting to read. And that my hope is that as you read the Psalms more and more, you'll come to like them. I don't know, maybe almost as much as I do, because I think I like them a lot. Um, let's see here. Just a couple of questions before I turn it back over to Kelly. Um, so definitely a few people asking questions about Psalm 82 and the names and the names for God. Where I said I think it says Elohim, and I think it probably was we should be reading that as Yahweh. And so people said, like, why Elohim and not Yahweh? Does the choice of Elohim suggest something about the writing? Why not use the name Yahweh? So a few things. I don't know. Is the broad answer. The more detailed answer is, I mean, there's a bunch of possibilities. If this is a psalm that was originally Canaanite that was brought into Israel at some point, or Israelites took up at some point, I can imagine them just taking the Baal and putting in Elohim to sort of genericize it. It's also possible that I mean, I think Psalm 82 falls into the like group of psalms that we generally call the Elohistic ones, where you just get the name of God as Elohim, even where you'd expect it as here to be Yahweh. And that may be an editorial layer that has happened. So anyway, lots of possibilities there. No way of knowing. No way of knowing. A couple more about Psalm 82. Just are pagan deities in the ancient Middle East known for their justice? And the answer is yes. Just the same way that the language we get about Israel's God as upholding justice is simply borrowed from both Canaanite language of God's doing justice and Mesopotamian. Right? If you think about the famous Code of Hammurabi, which is a law code that mostly exists to express the idea that Hammurabi, this great king, is great because he imposes justice. Right? But the beginning of it is the deity, right? Marduk, who is the chief god in Mesopotamia, right? Like establishes justice, and I am, like the deity on earth, and so I'm like Marduk gave me justice to give to you. So it's definitely a widespread ancient Near Eastern thing. Somebody asked in Psalm 82, who are the wretched, the needy? Is this a group of people in particular? I don't think so. I think that it is simply part of the widespread biblical like preference for and attention to the vulnerable. It's the needy, it's the orphan, it's the widow, it's et cetera. And I think that there's multiplicity of generic terms there speaks to that. Okay, a couple more. Are there any specific Second Temple or rabbinic sources that talk about how the Psalms are recited, sung, said, or otherwise read? There are certainly rabbinic sources. Amazingly, and sort of, I guess, weirdly, it's not that weird. I am more familiar with Hebrew Bible and rabbinic stuff and Second Temple stuff in the middle. I'm less wonderful at. In part because of just my training. But there's definitely rabbinic sources that talk about, and I think I mentioned this in the first session or certainly early or maybe a later one. There are early rabbinic texts like from the Mishnah, so like first, second century of the Common Era that talk about the reciting of certain psalms at festivals, for example. There's not much about like the actual like performance singing that I can think of. But I can say there are texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about that have like heavenly recitation of psalms or poetry at least. So it's definitely out there. Somebody asks to read the psalms in the ways that I suggest here at the end. Can you do that with the English translation, or is it better if you know Hebrew? It's obviously better if you know Hebrew. It is possible with a good English translation. You're always going to miss the thing, which is just, I mean, we have to, like, this is always true. Anytime you're reading a translation, you're missing stuff. Okay. Once we accept that, a good English translation, and I don't even know if I can think of like what a really good one is. I mean, we've talked about this a little, like you would like a translation that really tries to capture the parallelism of the thing. And many English translations don't do a terrific job of that because they're trying to, whatever, English translations try and make it into like good English poetry in a sense, as opposed to representing what counted as good Hebrew poetry, which to our ears can feel repetitive and stilted and weird. But of course, that's where their artistry comes in. So it's possible in English. I mean, I think I said at another point, I would really just suggest if you're not going to learn Hebrew, and I understand that you're not, finding someone who knows it to study with. I wish I had a better answer. This is one of the reasons that I love teaching poetry, is because there's so much reward for the reader who can access what is otherwise inaccessible to an English speaker. Anyway, that's my that's what I'm gonna stop there with the hopes that you will continue thinking about and reading the Psalms in whatever way you can, with all of the limitations that come with knowing only English. Or maybe I will just encourage you to all go out and learn Hebrew. Yale Divinity School offers a 6-week summer online intensive biblical Hebrew course. You can get an entire year of biblical Hebrew in 6 short weeks over the summer. And wouldn't it be so funny if suddenly that is now flooded with all of you learning? That would be great. There are ways to do it. And in the absence of it, I don't know, like understanding something of the structure, I think, can help, even in English.